My brother's wife was sitting at my kitchen table when I walked through the front door. Not standing, sitting, like she lived there, like she had every right to be in my home on a Tuesday afternoon without a single text, without a call, without so much as a knock on a door she apparently already had a key to open. My sister-in-law looked up at me, and for exactly 1 second, something crossed her face. Not guilt, not embarrassment, just the brief, mechanical recalculation of someone who had been caught slightly earlier than expected. Then she smiled. "We need to talk," she said. My brother was leaning against my kitchen counter with his arms folded, staring at a spot on the floor. He didn't look up. I set my bag down slowly. I looked at my sister-in-law. I looked at my brother. I looked at the papers spread out across my kitchen table, in my apartment, which I paid for, which I owned, and I said, very quietly, "How did you get in?" My sister-in-law waved a hand. "Your brother had a spare key from when you were in the hospital last year. We've been waiting for almost 2 hours." I didn't say anything to that. I just looked at my brother, who still hadn't looked up from the floor, and I understood that whatever was about to happen, he already knew it was wrong, and he was going to let her do it anyway. That was the moment I stopped being surprised and started being very, very careful. My sister-in-law pushed one of the papers toward me across the table. It was a power of attorney document. My name was on it. My signature was on it. I had never signed it. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. I didn't pick up the paper. I didn't touch it. I just looked at it. And then I looked at her. And I said, "What is this for?" It wasn't a question. My voice made it not a question. She launched into it immediately, the way people do when they've rehearsed something so many times that they can't actually stop once they start. My brother's business. The debt. $260,000 owed to investors who were not, she made clear, the kind of people who were patient about these things. The timeline, the pressure, the fact that family is supposed to show up for each other. My brother finally looked up when she said that last part. He looked at me, and his expression was asking me to understand, asking me to just go along with it, asking me to be the older sister who had always been the one to smooth things over and absorb whatever damage the people in my family couldn't be bothered to contain themselves. I looked back at him for a long moment. Then I said, "You forged my signature on a power of attorney." My sister-in-law started to say something about how it was just paperwork, how I could ratify it now, how it would accomplish the same thing either way. I stood up. "I need you both to leave," I said. "Right now." My brother said my name. Just my name, in that tone. The one he had been using on me since we were children, the one that was supposed to remind me that I was part of this family, and that being part of this family meant a specific set of obligations that only ever seemed to run in one direction. "Get out of my apartment," I said. "Give me the key, and don't come back without calling first." My sister-in-law gathered the papers. She looked at me with something that was almost pity, like I was being naive, like I didn't understand how the world worked. She said, "We've already started the process. The account manager at Meridian is expecting the paperwork tomorrow morning. You're making this harder than it needs to be." I handed my brother a plastic bag from my counter for him to put the key in. He dropped it in without meeting my eyes. They left. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment after the door closed. Then I picked up my phone and called my financial advisor. "Let me back up, because you need to understand what account we're talking about. 8 years ago, when I was 31, I took a job that required me to relocate twice in 3 years, live out of a suitcase, and eat most of my meals alone in hotel rooms in cities where I didn't know anyone. It was not glamorous. It was not fun. But the compensation was substantial, and I had nobody depending on me and nowhere particular to spend the money, so I saved almost everything. I put it into an investment account at a firm called Meridian Wealth Management. Over 8 years, with contributions and returns, that account had grown to just over $1.1 million. I was not a person who came from money. My parents were ordinary people who worked ordinary jobs and stretched every dollar and never quite managed to save anything that lasted. My brother had followed a similar pattern, except that he had also made a series of business decisions that I had, privately, considered optimistic at best. His wife had her own spending habits that I will describe only as ambitious. I had watched, over the years, as the gap between what my brother earned and what his household spent gradually widened into something that couldn't be explained away by bad luck or bad timing. It was structural. It was a lifestyle they had constructed on the assumption that money would continue to appear from somewhere. I had loaned my brother money twice before. Not large amounts. Both times I told myself it was a gift. Both times he told me he would pay it back. He never did, and I never brought it up because I had the money to spare, and he was my brother, and I didn't want to make it a thing. But I had also, 14 months earlier, after the second loan and a conversation with my financial advisor that I still think about, done something quiet and deliberate. I had placed a secondary authorization requirement on my Meridian account, meaning any transaction above $10,000 required confirmation through a secondary verification process, a specific code sent to a secondary email address, plus a callback to a phone number that was not my primary number, plus a written authorization form that had to be submitted in person or via certified mail with notarized signature. My financial advisor had suggested it. She called it a friction layer. She said it was something she recommended for clients whose accounts had reached a certain size. I remember thinking at the time that it was probably unnecessary, that I was being paranoid. I thought about that conversation while I waited for her to pick up. She answered on the second ring. I told her that someone had presented, or was about to present, a power of attorney document authorizing transactions on my account, and that I believed the document was forged. I told her to flag the account, to reject any documentation that arrived, and to contact me before taking any action regardless of what any paperwork said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need to ask you something directly. Is the person who may be presenting this document someone you have any personal relationship with? I said yes. She said, then I want you to call the police tonight, not tomorrow. Document that you made this call. Document the time. Send me an email right now, while we're on the phone, confirming what you just told me verbally. I sent the email while she was still speaking. She said, the secondary authorization on your account means nothing gets processed without going through the full protocol. No one can move money out of this account with just a POA, forged or otherwise. But if they've already attempted to initiate something, there may be a paper trail that you're going to want. I asked her if anyone had already contacted the firm. She put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, she said, someone called this afternoon identifying themselves as you. They confirmed your account number and asked about the process for a POA authorized liquidation. The representative they spoke with followed protocol and told them they would need to submit the documentation in person and go through the secondary authorization process. The caller said they would come in tomorrow morning with the paperwork. I sat down on my couch. I'm going to flag this account as disputed right now, my advisor said. No one is touching it. But I want to be clear with you, what you're describing is financial fraud, wire fraud, potentially identity theft. This is a criminal matter. I already knew that. I think I had known it from the moment I saw those papers on my kitchen table. I just needed someone else to say it out loud. I called the police that night. I filed a report. The officer I spoke with took notes and told me that because no money had actually been moved yet, the investigation would need to develop before any arrests could happen, but that the documented intent combined with the forged document constituted attempted fraud and I should preserve everything. I preserved everything. I took photographs of my kitchen table before they had fully closed the door behind them. Something I had thought to do in the 30 seconds after I told them to leave. The papers were gone, but the table was still slightly displaced, and there were 2 cups on the counter from when they had apparently made themselves coffee while waiting for me. Then I called my attorney. She was not a criminal attorney. She was the woman who had handled my condo purchase 3 years earlier and who I had kept as a contact because she struck me as the kind of person who stayed calm when other people didn't. I told her what had happened. She gave me the name of a criminal attorney and also told me to send her everything in writing immediately. I did not call my brother that night. I did not call my parents. I went to bed at 11 o'clock, which I recognize sounds strange under the circumstances, but I had a presentation the next morning, and I had already done everything I could do, and I have learned over the years that catastrophizing in the dark accomplishes exactly nothing. The next morning, I went to Meridian Wealth Management in person. Not because I needed to, my advisor had already locked the account, but because I wanted to be there. I arrived at 9:15. At 9:42, my brother and his wife walked through the front door. My brother saw me first. He stopped walking immediately, like he had hit a wall. His wife was already reaching into her bag for the papers. She was 2 full steps ahead of him before she looked up and registered what she was seeing. I was sitting in one of the chairs in the lobby. I had a coffee. I looked at them both. My sister-in-law recovered faster than my brother. She straightened up and said, still moving toward the reception desk, "You don't have to make a scene. I'm just sitting here," I said. One of the senior advisors came out from the back. He had clearly been briefed. He introduced himself to my brother and his wife and said he understood they were there to submit some documentation and asked them to follow him to a private room. I stood up. I said, I'd like to be present for this. My sister-in-law said that wasn't appropriate. The senior advisor looked between us and said, very carefully, that given the circumstances and the flag on the account, he would actually need to ask us all to come into the conference room together, and that there was someone else who would be joining them shortly. That someone else was a representative from the firm's fraud and compliance department who had been in the building since 9 o'clock. In the conference room, my sister-in-law laid the power of attorney document on the table. The compliance officer picked it up, looked at it, set it back down, and said, Miss, and then said my name. Can you confirm that this is your signature? It is not, I said. My brother said my name again. He said I was making a mistake. He said that I didn't understand the situation they were in, that these were not people you owed money to and kept them waiting, that he had exhausted every other option, that this was the only way. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, you forged my signature on a legal document to steal $1.1 million from me. He flinched at the word steal. I watched him flinch at it, and I understood something about my brother in that moment that I don't think I had ever let myself see clearly before, that he had spent our entire lives framing his choices in language that made them sound like something other than what they were, and that the language had worked on me for a very long time, and that it was not going to work anymore. The account has a secondary authorization protocol, the compliance officer said, speaking to my sister-in-law now, who had gone very still. Even with a valid power of attorney, any transaction over $10,000 requires a multi-step verification process that involves direct contact with the account holder at a secondary contact address. Even if this document were authentic, no funds could be transferred without Miss, and again my name, her direct participation. My sister-in-law looked at the document on the table. Then she looked at my brother. Then she said, to no one in particular. I didn't know about that. She set it up 14 months ago, the compliance officer said. He said it like a statement of fact, without inflection, but I heard it clearly and I thought, 14 months ago, right after the second loan, right after the conversation with my advisor, right after the quiet, private decision I made, alone, in this same building, to put a little friction between my savings and the people in my life who might one day decide it was partly theirs. Security was called. Not aggressively, 2 people stood near the door. The compliance officer told my brother and his wife that the documentation they had submitted appeared to contain a fraudulent signature on a legal instrument, that the firm had already been in contact with law enforcement, and that they were not permitted to leave the building until a detective arrived. My sister-in-law said something about a lawyer. The compliance officer said that was absolutely her right. My brother looked at me across the conference table. His face had done something complicated, the recalculations, the reassessments, all of it visible at once, like watching someone's internal architecture shift. He said, very quietly, did you know we were coming? I knew someone was coming, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, we needed the money. You have more than you'll ever spend. You would never have even noticed. And there it was, that sentence. The one that had been underneath everything, underneath the forged signature, underneath the fake power of attorney, underneath the 2 cups of coffee on my counter, from when they had let themselves into my home and helped themselves to whatever they felt like while waiting for me to arrive so they could explain why I should surrender $1 million to cover a debt that had nothing to do with me. You have more than you'll ever spend. You would never have even noticed. I thought about 8 years of hotel rooms. I thought about the relocations, the dinners alone, the years I had spent being disciplined and deliberate and careful with every decision, while my brother spent freely and borrowed easily and landed here, in a conference room, trying to take from me what he had never thought to build for himself. I would have noticed, I said. I notice everything. The detective arrived 40 minutes later. She was calm and professional and asked my brother and his wife to accompany her to the precinct. They were not handcuffed in the building, but they left without me. My brother called me from the precinct waiting room. I didn't answer. He called from a different number 2 hours later, his wife's cell, and I didn't answer that either. He left a voicemail that I listened to once and then saved, on the advice of my attorney, without responding to it. The investigation moved faster than I expected, which my criminal attorney said was unusual but not surprising given the quality of the documentation. The forged POA was professionally examined. The signature was definitively identified as not mine. Phone records showed that a call had been made to Meridian Wealth Management from my sister-in-law's cell phone using my account information the afternoon before they appeared at my apartment. My brother's business debt, it turned out, was not quite what they had described. The $260,000 was real, But there was also an additional $140,000 that had not come up in my kitchen, owed to different creditors in a different category. My sister-in-law, it emerged during the investigation, had known about all of it for considerably longer than she had let on to my brother, which became relevant to how the charges were eventually distributed. My parents called. Of course they called. My mother called 11 times over 3 days before I picked up. And when I did, she said, "You have to understand how desperate they were." And I said, "I do understand. I'm also the victim of a crime." She said I was being cold. I said I was being accurate. We were quiet for a moment, and then she said, very carefully, "Your father and I don't have the money to help them." I said, "I know. I'm not asking you to." She said, "But you could." I said, "Mom." They forged my signature on a legal document. They let themselves into my home. They tried to liquidate my life savings. I am not the person who needs to fix this. She didn't say anything to that. I think she heard it. I think she had always known, somewhere, that the dynamic in our family had run in this direction for a long time, and that it had been held in place partly by my willingness to absorb things that should have had consequences. I don't say that with anger. She did her best. But there was a version of this conversation that I had needed to have for a very long time, and I had it, and I did not apologize for it. The criminal case resolved 11 months after that morning in the conference room. My sister-in-law pleaded guilty to 1 count of forgery and 1 count of attempted wire fraud. She received a sentence of 18 months, with eligibility for parole after 12. She served 14 months before she was released. My brother was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, which his attorney negotiated down in exchange for his cooperation and his testimony about the business creditors, several of whom turned out to be involved in a separate investigation that I was never fully briefed on. He received 3 years of probation, a substantial fine, and was required to complete 200 hours of community service. The business was liquidated. The creditors received partial payment. The rest of the debt was discharged through a bankruptcy proceeding that my brother's attorney filed on his behalf 3 months after the guilty pleas. My parents lost nothing in all of this. They had nothing to lose, financially. What they lost was the comfortable fiction that the family had been holding together, which I think they knew had not been entirely true for some time. My brother and I have not spoken, as of when I'm telling you this, in just over a year. He sent me a letter, an actual handwritten letter, mailed through the postal service about 8 months ago. I have read it 4 times. I haven't responded yet. I'm not sure I will. I'm not sure what I would say that would mean anything, or what he would hear. I want to be careful here, because I think it's easy to tell a story like this and have the ending be clean in a way that real things are almost never clean. The truth is that there is no version of what happened that gives me back the brother I thought I had before I walked through my front door and found his wife sitting at my kitchen table. There is no legal outcome, no guilty plea, no sentence served that undoes the specific knowledge that my brother looked at my savings account and thought, she'd never notice. But here is what is also true. The secondary authorization I put on that account cost me nothing and took me 20 minutes to set up. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not born of paranoia or suspicion toward any specific person. It was just a small, quiet decision to put a layer of protection between my financial security and the general uncertainty of the world. It stopped everything, every piece of it. Because when the moment came, and it did come, and it came from a direction I had not anticipated, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It required my presence, my direct participation, my actual consent. No one can take what requires you to be there to give it. I still live in the same apartment. I still have the same job. The account at Meridian is still there, still growing, still protected by the same multi-step authorization it has had since I was 37 years old and sitting in my financial advisor's office thinking, somewhat idly, that this seemed like a reasonable precaution. I changed the lock on my front door the afternoon my brother and his wife left with the detective. I should have done that after I gave the spare key back. I should have done a lot of things. But the door is locked now, and the account is protected, and I sleep well, which is something I want you to hear clearly. I sleep well, not because everything is resolved or healed or finished, but because I did the right things at the right moments, and when it mattered, the walls held. That's all I wanted to tell you. If you have people in your life who look at what you've built and calculate what percentage of it they could argue is owed to them, and I suspect, from the comments I read on stories like mine, that more of you than you'd like to admit do have those people. Please don't wait for them to make their move before you put your protections in place. Don't be generous with access to things that took you years to build. Don't mistake family loyalty for an obligation to remain financially vulnerable to the people who share your last name. The friction layer costs almost nothing. The conversation with your financial advisor takes less than an hour. The lock on your door takes 15 minutes to change. Do it now, while everything is fine. Do it especially if everything is fine, because that is precisely when they don't think you're watching. I was watching. That made all the difference.